Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. I'm so glad you've joined me today. In this video, I'm going to share with you how I created these two cards. Now, they're using two different ways to create the same type of image at the end. One is a little bit more clean and the other one is a little bit more grungy and has a little bit more embossing powder speckle on this embossed image. So I'm going to be using this Roses 3D embossing folder, and I'm using watercolor paper. And the first thing I like to do before putting my paper in the embossing folder is use a distress sprayer and spray both sides of the paper. This way it's going to soften the paper. And as I'm running it back and forth through my Big Shot machine, it's pressing that paper right into the grooves of the embossing folder. I'm using several different re-inkers here, and I'm going to watercolor the image. I'll have all the supplies as well as the re-inker colors listed down in the description below. I'm using the re-inkers because they've got a really nice bright concentration of color. And to create this background, I want to have a nice bright contrast between the color of the flowers as well as the black background. So in order to lock my paper in place, I like to spritz my surface with some water, then put my watercolor paper down and then spritz the top part of it. I find that by spritzing the bottom as well as the top, or having water in the bottom as well as the top, I prevent that paper from curling. If you've ever worked with water on watercolor paper or even mixed media paper, the paper tends to curl because we only wet one side of it. By wetting both sides, I prevent that from happening. It kind of suctions it onto my surface as I'm working. It does take longer to dry this way, but if you notice that the water has pretty much absorbed into your paper, you can lift it off of your surface and put it on some paper towel, and that will help speed up the drying a little bit. So while my paper is wet, I'm using 5 different colors of the Distress re-inkers, and I'm coloring my images. So I've got a green and a blue that I did for the leaves, and then the flowers I'm going to do a yellow, a pink, and a purple. And I'm being very, very light-handed with this and very flowy, if you will, putting the color down. It's going to move, so I don't need to be painting in a lot of detail because a lot of those details are going to get lost when I go and spray my ink again once I'm done. Any of the ink that seeps onto the background is not a problem because we're going to do an embossing technique on the background that's going to completely cover that anyways. Although it does look kind of cool how the ink seeps into the background. So I may at one point have to try this technique and not put the black on the background. Once I've got my images completely colored how I want, I spritz it again just to help that ink to flow and then let it sit to dry. While I've got my inks out here, I figured I might as well do a couple more backgrounds for other techniques that I'll set aside later. If I'm going to wait for one paper to dry, I might as well wait for several at the same time because they'll all dry together. So for this second one here, I just have some watercolor paper. I spritz my mat, put my paper down, spritz the top as well, and then I'm just putting the different colors on that paper, and then I'll let them completely dry. I will mist them once again once I've got all the colors down, just in case there were some areas that were a little bit drier. It'll just help the inks flow. You'll notice as it dries that the inks will continue to flow until that ink has completely absorbed into the paper. The other thing you can spray with is a water bottle that has some Perfect Pearls in it, or even a mica spray if you want to have your background shimmery. So I'm going to do a third background here, and this one I'm going to kind of do just more stripes of color. I'm going to use the same 5 colors, but I'm just going to use stripes of them just to kind of see how they flow. And when I do the second background, when I do a technique with it, I'll do the same thing with the third one. I think it'll just be fun to look at the difference here. So same technique as the first two. I'm just putting the color down, and once I have all the color down, I'm going to spritz again to help that ink flow together. I have a paper towel there just to clean off my brush in between colors. This particular water brush has water in the handle, and it's my absolute favorite because I'm a klutz. And if I had a water a water cup on my surface, I would likely spritz it over or spill it over and make a mess of things. So by having the water right in my brush, I can just squeeze the excess onto the paper towel, wipe my brush off, and it's ready for my next color. I'm not contaminating my colors this way, and it just makes it nice and easy. And it's really handy to only have one brush rather than a brush plus a bottle or a cup of water. Now that my inks have set a little bit, if you find you have pooling anywhere, you can use a dry paper towel and lift up some of those areas. All that's going to do for this particular technique, for this particular card, is speed up drying time. Because I'm planning on covering up the background, it's not going to matter if you have time to wait to let those completely dry. Once they are completely dry, and you can see that at some point I put them on a piece of paper towel here just to help speed up the drying. Once they are completely dry, I've lost a little bit of the detail of the flowers in spritzing it, watercoloring it, and letting it dry. So I'm going to get that detail back again. I lightly mist both sides, run it back and forth through my die cutting machine, and then let that paper completely dry before we move on to the next step. The next step is doing the background, and if we didn't let it dry completely, the embossing powder is going to stick to everything. So by letting it dry completely, when I go do this next step here, I'm going to have the embossing powder only sticking to the ink. So I've got some Versamark ink here, and I'm just lightly tapping on the flat side of my embossing folder so that I'm doing the background. And you notice right before this, I took some Spellbinders tape and I just taped my paper in place. I lined the paper up with the texture on the embossing folder, and it kind of locks in place, so it's really easy to line up this way. I put the Versamark ink on the flat side, and I also brayered some on there just to make sure that I had a nice even coat on there. Pour the embossing powder on top of the Versamark ink once we've run it through our machine. And the Versamark is only going to go on the raised areas of that embossing folder, which once we've got the paper here, it's actually the background. But when you look at the folder, there's a lot of areas that are level with the background in the flowers and leaves. So you get some embossing powder in there as well because the Versamark ink is in there. Any area you don't want powder, you can take a soft brush and you can brush it off and then tap the excess off. For this particular background, I left some of that embossing powder on the flowers. I kind of liked that grungy look at that point, but as we went through it, I kind of thought it started looking a little bit messy, which is what prompted me to do a second one with a bit of a different technique just to see if I would get a better result, and I actually did like the result of that one better. If there's any areas in that background that didn't get embossing powder on top of them, you can use an embossing pen and color in those areas just to get that sticky ink on there so that embossing powder will stick to those areas and then you can melt it. I did do this for this background. I put it on some areas, and then I found that those areas when I melted that powder, those areas were quite a bit darker than the other ones. So I do go back and put this in my embossing folder and redo step one just to get a more even background. But it is a good way to get any areas that didn't get any ink before filled in so that you don't have any blank spots. After putting that powder on, I haven't set it yet, but you've seen me do it. I use an embossing tool to melt that powder. It must be an embossing tool because an embossing tool will emit heat and melt the powder where it is. One of the most asked questions about embossing that I've ever had is, can you use a blow dryer? And you can't, because a blow dryer blows air, whereas an embossing tool emits heat. So a blow dryer will just blow your embossing powder off and dry your ink, whereas an embossing tool will heat up things where they are. With the background done to a point where I like it, I'm going to take a misting bottle that has some mica powder of Perfect Pearls mixed in with it, and I just sprayed it on there and let that dry. Anything that went onto the embossing just easily wipes right off, and anything that goes on the cardstock, the flowers, the leaves will just seep into the paper, and it'll just add a really nice shimmer to it. Once that's completely dry, I cut my paper down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 so that when I put it on a card, I have a nice frame around it. I chose a color for the background or for the card base that I thought enhanced the background there, and I'm using some Distress Collage medium to glue that down. I will use some acrylic blocks to hold things in place while it dries. Because 3D embossing folders have a lot of ups and downs to them, you want to make sure it's got good contact with that card base. While that is drying, I decided to start working on a second background, and for this one, I decided not to color my flowers first. What I'm going to do is use my brayer with that Versamark ink again. I've already got my paper embossed, and I've got it locked into place. I've got the cardstock all completely dried, so that embossing powder is only going to stick to the Versamark ink. I brayer a nice coat on top of it, and then I go and take a paper towel and I wipe off any areas that the Versamark might have gone on while I was brayering, and put it in my machine, and I put it back and forth a couple times. Then I can put my embossing powder on there, and I can see already that I got a bit better coverage on the background, as well as the fact that I don't have as much embossing powder on my flowers. I'm still going to take a detail brush and brush any embossing powder that did go on my flowers and leaves where I didn't want it to go. This time I'm using a brush that's a little bit more detailed than the one I used for the first version of this card. I'm going to use my embossing tool to melt that powder. And there was a few areas when I brushed or when I wiped that excess Versamark off that I got off of the background. So I'm going to use that embossing pen, and I'm going to color those areas and put more embossing powder on them. Basically, the background steps for this second card are the same as the first one. The difference is I haven't already watercolored my flowers, as well as the fact that I took a paper towel and I wiped off some of the excess Versamark before I transferred it over to my embossed image. Once I have my background embossed how I like, I can start watercoloring my flowers. I'm going to use exactly the same colors as I used in the first one, but you'll notice with this one, because I've got less water on my background, the colors are much more vibrant. And that's something that I actually ended up really liking. When I did the first one, I was kind of disappointed how dull the flowers looked after they completely dried. And I really liked with this second one how the vibrancy of the flowers were right there. Now, there's nothing to say there's anything wrong with the muted tones of the first one. It's just not the look that I was thinking of in my head when I started it. So it's nice to know different ways to get different looks for this. If you use more water, you're going to have a more muted background or colored part. If you use less water, you're going to have a more vibrant background. Now I did the technique the same way. I used the green on the leaves, blue to make some darker areas in the leaves, and then I went back over with green just to tone down the blue and kind of make it a darker green looking. Once the leaves are done as I like them to be, I'm going to start doing the colors on the flowers, the yellow, the pink, and the purple. You want to make sure to completely clean off your brush between working with the greens and blues and the yellows, because we don't really want green in the center of our flowers. Now, just like the last one, the colors are going to blend as they dry, so I don't need to be super detailed with my watercoloring. I'm just putting the colors basically where I want them to go. Because this is 3D, it's going to start sinking into the nooks and crannies. So I am going to get some color movement as it dries, and that's exactly what I was looking for. Now I'm doing this technique on an image embossing folder that's got some flowers and leaves on it. You could do it on whatever embossing folder you want. It doesn't necessarily need to just be this. This is a great way to do it if you want to be more precise where you want the colors, because I knew that I wanted blues and greens for my leaves, as well as the yellows, pinks, and purples for my flowers. If you're doing an all over background, obviously you can be a little bit more fluid and a little bit more artistic with where you put the different colors. Now, before I let this dry, I'm going to do that same mist bottle with the Perfect Pearls in them. And what that's going to do is it's just going to absorb into my flowers, and then I'll be able to wipe it off the background. Now for this one, I decided to do it a little bit different. I'm going to get the same result, but just in a bit of a different way. So I've sprayed the Perfect Pearls mist into my embossing folder, and then I wiped the areas that were flat. Now the flat areas are the areas that are going to be black on my embossing folder. So by doing this, I'm only applying that pearl powder or pearl mist to the flowers. Now you'll notice as I put that through my embossing folder, I lost the glossiness of my embossing background in some areas. So to get that back, just take out your heat tool and go over it again. Once that is completely dry, I take the paper and cut it down in my trimmer. Again, I'm cutting this down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, so that when I put it on a card base that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, I get a nice frame around it, and it enhances the background. So I'm using Distress Collage Medium to glue my pieces down. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to cut my sentiment. Now, I originally planned to do this sentiment. I had it on order and it just arrived. But once I got it in, I realized it was a little bit too wide for this background. So I'm going to do this thanks die instead that I have for my stash. I've got my colored backgrounds for these dies already done. I have 3 of each of those shadow parts cut and glued and layered. And I'm just going to work on the thanks center part. So I had cut them out of black cardstock, but when I laid them on the front of the card, the black cardstock was a little bit dull and it was a little bit off color from the embossed background. So the easy way to fix that is to press those die cuts into some Versamark ink and apply the same black embossing powder that I used for my background. That way they're going to match exactly. And I'm going to get a nice glossy texture to that sentiment. Now you'll want to have some tweezers here just to kind of hold your sentiment down while you're embossing it. Otherwise it's going to fly all over your desk from the air from the heat embossing tool. Now I did the first layer and I found that it wasn't quite enough and there was a couple spots that I missed on one of the sentiments. So initially I was going to do a second layer just on the one that had missed a couple spots, but once I had it done, I really liked the thickness that that second layer gave the sentiment, so I ended up doing that with both of them. Once that's cooled down, I've glued the center part of the thanks to the shadow part and let that dry, and now I'm going to glue it to the front of my card. I found that when I glued the thanks part to the shadow, I needed to use some Glossy Accents because it just stuck a little bit better than the Distress Collage medium did. I had some grittiness from embossing powder, some that had stuck to the back of the die cut that hadn't actually embossed, and using the Glossy Accents was the perfect way to go. Once the center thanks is glued to the shadow part and it's dry, I can glue that to the front of my card. I always put an acrylic block on top of it just to hold it in place and make sure it's got good contact with the card base while it's drying. That also frees my hands up to work on something else while it's drying. I tend to get a little bit bored just holding things in place while they dry. So I'm gluing the second one down, and I glued it a little bit lower on the card. As I was working on the card, I didn't like all the grittiness and the embossing powder that had stuck to that flower for that first one that I thought I was going to like. So I'm hiding a little bit of that with that thanks sentiment, just so it's not quite as noticeable. So here we've got the 2 different cards there. This is the first one that's got a little bit more of the black grunginess, the embossing powder in the leaves and flowers. And the second one is a little bit more clean and a little bit more vibrant. Post in the comments below which is your favorite, because I'm really curious if your favorite is the same as mine. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I hope you have a fabulous day.